Let me paint you a picture. You wake up one morning, sit down at your computer, turn it on, and something feels off. The taskbar you've used for 20 years is now centered. The start menu you knew like the back of your hand has been completely gutted. And then, somewhere in the settings, buried under layers of menus and toggles, you start to realize that your computer, the machine sitting in your home on your desk that you paid for, is quietly watching everything you do, recording it, analyzing it, and sending it somewhere you never explicitly agreed to. That moment, that creeping, uncomfortable realization, is the Windows 11 story, and it didn't have to be this way. Microsoft released Windows 11 with the kind of confidence that only a company with decades of dominance can muster. It was bold, it was polished. It was, they told us, the future of personal computing. And on paper, some of that was even true. But somewhere between the boardroom vision and the bedroom computer, something went catastrophically wrong. Not in the way that makes headlines on launch day, not the kind of disaster that trends on social media and gets walked back in a week. This was slower, quieter, more insidious, and in many ways, far more damaging than any single visible failure could have been. What we're dealing with here is a product that by raw installation numbers looks like a success, but by every metric that actually matters to the people living inside it, tells a very different store why. To understand the full scope of what happened, you have to look at three separate but deeply connected failures. Each one is serious on its own, but together, they form a picture of an organization that lost sight of who it was actually building for. The first thing Microsoft got catastrophically wrong was the hardware wall it built around Windows 11 before a single person could even try it. When the system requirements were announced, there was genuine confusion. TPM 2.0, Secure Boot, a processor compatibility list that excluded chips released as recently as 2017. At first, Microsoft framed this as a straightforward security upgrade. And to be fair, there is a real security argument here. TPM 2.0 and Secure Boot do meaningfully improve the platform's resistance to certain classes of attacks. Security researchers validated this. The technical rationale was not invented. But here's where the story gets complicated. The processor exclusion list was not simply a security-driven cutoff. Many of the excluded chips were functionally capable of meeting the exact security requirements Windows 11 was citing. The TPM 2.0 argument could have justified a narrower exclusion. Instead, the compatibility wall landed precisely where it needed to land to push a significant portion of the user base toward buying new hardware. The security justification was real, but so was the commercial motivation sitting quietly behind it. And Microsoft chose to lead entirely with the former while saying almost nothing about the latter. The scale of the excluded population turned out to be enormous, substantially larger than Microsoft's own pre-launch estimates had suggested. We're talking about hundreds of millions of machines, owned by people who had no reason to expect that a free operating system upgrade would suddenly tell them their hardware was obsolete. These were not ancient, struggling computers. Many of them were machines purchased in 2017, 2018, 2019. Machines that ran Windows 10 flawlessly. Machines that, by any reasonable definition, still worked. So what happened when those users got the incompatibility notification? Microsoft had a theory. The theory was they'll buy new hardware. The hardware refresh cycle would get a jolt. PC manufacturers would benefit. Everyone wins. What actually happened was more interesting and more damaging. A meaningful segment of those users didn't buy new hardware. They started asking questions. They started researching Linux. They started wondering, perhaps for the first time, whether Windows was actually the only option. The frustration of being told your machine is too old when it clearly isn't drove a level of platform investigation that Microsoft's sales projections had never modeled. And some of those investigations led to permanent departures. The Linux distribution download statistics that began climbing in the years following Windows 11's launch are not unrelated to that moment. That's the real cost of the hardware wall. Not just the users who stayed frustrated and stuck on Windows 10 waiting for its end-of-life deadline, but the users who used the frustration as a doorway out of the Windows ecosystem entirely. The second failure is the one that generated the most immediate, visceral, and sustained backlash from everyday users. And it came down to something that sounds almost trivially small, where the Start button lives on your screen. For nearly 30 years, from Windows 95 through every major version of Windows that followed, the Start button sat in the lower left corner of the screen. Not because of any single engineering decision that was revisited and confirmed each time, it just lived there. And in living there, it became something far more powerful than a design choice. It became muscle memory. Billions of interactions across billions of users over decades had wired that lower left motion into the body itself. You didn't think about where the Start button was. Your hand already knew. Windows 11 moved it to the center. Now, let's be honest about what the design team was going for. Visually, the center taskbar is more balanced. It feels more modern. It's easier on the eye in the way that compositional symmetry tends to be. There's nothing aesthetically indefensible about what they did. If you were designing a brand new operating system from scratch, with no installed base and no legacy, centering the taskbar would be a perfectly reasonable choice. But that's not the situation Microsoft was in. Microsoft was updating an operating system used by over 1 billion people, most of whom had been using Windows for a decade or more. The question was never, is centering the taskbar aesthetically better? The question should have been, does the aesthetic improvement justify forcing 1 billion people to relearn a reflex they've spent 30 years developing? And somehow, that question either wasn't asked or was asked and answered in a way that prioritized the designer's vision over the user's workflow. The backlash was immediate, and it was sustained. Community forums filled up. Reddit threads stretched for miles. Tech publications ran piece after piece on the growing user frustration. And Microsoft did eventually add a registry setting, and later a proper option, to move the taskbar back to the left, which raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If they always had the ability to offer that choice, why wasn't it offered on day one? But the taskbar was only the most visible piece of a much larger interface overhaul that followed the same philosophy throughout. The Start menu itself was redesigned from the ground up. Windows 10's live tiles, those dynamic real-time information panels that users could arrange, resize, and configure in ways that matched their specific workflows, were simply removed. In their place came a static grid of pinned application icons. Less information, less customization, less density, less of everything that power users and workflow-oriented users had specifically come to rely on. The live tiles were divisive. Not everyone loved them. But the people who had invested time in configuring them, who had built a morning routine around glancing at their Start menu and seeing their calendar, their news, their weather, their email count, all at a glance. Those users lost real functionality, and they received nothing in return except a cleaner look that served the aesthetic vision more than it served them. This is the pattern that defines the Windows 11 interface overhaul. Decisions made for how it looks rather than how it works. All delivered without meaningful user input and without the humility to acknowledge that 30 years of established workflow deserves more than an aesthetic override. The third failure is the one that goes deepest. It's the one that isn't about a misplaced button or an excluded processor. It's the one that strikes at the fundamental question of trust between a user and the operating system they depend on every single day. Windows 11 dramatically expanded the scope of data collection, telemetry transmission, behavioral monitoring, and advertising infrastructure embedded in the operating system itself. This isn't speculation. It's documented. It's visible in network traffic analysis. It's visible in the settings menus, if you know where to look and what you're looking at. And it's visible in the steady stream of technical examinations published by privacy researchers in the years since the launch. Here's the thing. The existence of data collection in a commercial operating system is not, by itself, a scandal. Microsoft is a business. Businesses have commercial interests. The operating system collects data that feeds advertising models and AI training pipelines, and in exchange, the product is free to upgrade. That's a real exchange of value, and a transparent version of it would be something users could evaluate and decide whether to accept. The problem is the gap between what Windows 11 is actually doing with user data and what the average user who hasn't specifically gone digging understands to be happening. That gap is enormous. The settings menus are labyrinthine. The default configurations lean heavily toward Collectios. The explanations offered are written in language designed to minimize rather than inform. And the data collection is so deeply integrated into the operating system's architecture that truly opting out, to the extent that's even possible, requires a level of technical sophistication that the vast majority of users simply don't have. And then came Recall. If you haven't followed the Recall saga, here's the short version. Microsoft introduced a feature called Recall that continuously takes screenshots of everything happening on your screen and uses AI to make that visual history searchable. Everything you typed, every website you visited, every document you opened, every private message you sent, all of it captured, stored, and indexed. The feature was announced as a flagship Windows 11 selling point, and it was going to be enabled by default. The backlash was extraordinary. Security researchers immediately identified catastrophic vulnerabilities in how the captured data was being stored. Privacy advocates raised alarms loud enough that the story broke out of tech circles into mainstream news. Microsoft announced it was pulling Recall before it fully shipped and would return with improvements. That seemed, to many observers, like the end of the story. It wasn't. The feature was quietly reintroduced. With some modifications, yes. With an opt-in mechanism rather than opt-out, yes. But the reintroduction itself told the real story. The organizational commitment to this direction of surveillance infrastructure was strong enough to survive a very public, very forceful rejection from users and security professionals. The community said no loudly enough that Microsoft heard it, and then decided to come back anyway. That's the disaster's most revealing moment. Not the initial launch of recall, not even the initial backlash, but the reintroduction after the backlash. That's the moment that shows you where the organization's priorities actually sit when the promotional framing is stripped away. So why didn't Microsoft see any of this coming? That's the question worth sitting with, because the answer matters for understanding not just what went wrong, but whether it's likely to be corrected. The answer is perspective, or more precisely, the absence of one particular perspective in the rooms where these decisions were being made. When you are an organization of Microsoft's scale, with Microsoft's market position and Microsoft's commercial interests, the product decisions you make naturally begin to reflect the organization's view of the user rather than the user's experience of the product. The hardware requirements made sense from the vantage point of security teams and hardware partners and the commercial benefit of a refresh cycle. The interface redesign made sense from the vantage point of a design team inspired by the visual clarity of macOS and iOS. The data collection made sense from the vantage point of a company building out AI capabilities and advertising revenue streams. All of these decisions had internal logic. All of them had stakeholders who championed them and frameworks that justified them. What they lacked was the sustained, unfiltered voice of the person sitting in front of the screen. The person who had been using Windows since they were a teenager, who had their muscle memory wired to an interface, who had no interest in buying new hardware because their existing hardware worked fine, who had not explicitly consented to having everything on their screen photographed and indexed. The warning signals were available. Public forums were full of them during the beta period. Tech enthusiasts were raising the hardware exclusion concerns months before launch. Privacy advocates were writing about the data collection architecture in real time. The organizational perspective didn't elevate these signals to the level where they could modify the decisions that were already in motion. And so the users didn't see the disaster coming either. Not until they were inside it, reading the forum posts, working through the privacy settings screen by screen, and in some cases deciding that a Linux distribution was worth the learning curve. Here's where we actually are today. Windows 11's installation numbers look fine. OEM distribution means that every new PC sold ships with it, and those numbers fill in the market share statistics that the business press uses to measure success. But installation numbers and chosen adoption are very different things. The number of users who received Windows 11 because they bought a new computer is not the same as the number of users who would have chosen it if the choice had been genuinely open. The real metrics are harder to find but more honest. User satisfaction data. Windows 10 extended support uptake, which Microsoft ended up having to offer commercially under significant pressure because the user base that refused to upgrade was too large to simply let expire. Linux adoption curves that began tilting upward in precisely the demographic that Windows 11's hardware requirements hit hardest. Community sentiment measured not in headlines, but in the sustained daily volume of interface complaints and privacy concerns that have not diminished across years of updates. This is the disaster's true shape, not a product that failed in the market, a product that succeeded in the market while failing the people inside it. That distinction matters enormously. A commercially failed product gets canceled. A commercially successful product that erodes user trust and satisfaction just continues. The numbers look fine. The relationship underneath them quietly deteriorates. The path out of this, and Microsoft does have a path out of it, runs through something the organization has historically been reluctant to do, which is genuinely elevating the user's perspective before the decisions are made, rather than responding to community forum complaints after. That means designing hardware requirements that draw the security line at security capability rather than commercial opportunity. It means offering interface choices by default rather than burying them in settings after the backlash proves they're needed. It means writing data collection disclosures in language designed to inform rather than to bury, and making meaningful opt out genuinely accessible rather than architecturally obscured. And it means treating a feature like recall not as an organizational priority to be reintroduced over community objection, but as an experiment to be honestly abandoned when the users who it was supposed to serve clearly do not want it. None of this requires Microsoft to stop being a commercial enterprise. It requires Microsoft to recognize that the long-term commercial health of the Windows platform depends on users trusting it, choosing it, and wanting it rather than finding themselves stuck inside it. Trust is not infinite. It does not survive indefinitely on the momentum of a 20-year relationship, while the daily experience steadily chips away at the foundation. The users who downloaded a Linux distribution last year were not ideologues. They were people who ran out of patience. And the ones who stayed, who are still there, still using Windows 11, still posting in the forums, still working through the privacy settings, still looking for ways to get back the features they lost, those users represent an enormous amount of goodwill that Microsoft can still choose to honor rather than exhaust. The disaster happened because the organization didn't see it coming. Seeing it now, clearly, honestly, without the promotional framing, is the first step toward building something that users actually choose. And that's the version of Windows that would be worth getting excited about.